Good afternoon and welcome to the Arrowhead webinar series. Today's presentation is entitled Mastering Zirconia, the Key to Material Selection. We are delighted to welcome Dr. Thomas Hill, who is the Manager of Scientific Services at Ivoclar Vivadent. We appreciate him taking time out of his day to shed some light on this important topic and on this important material. We also want to thank all of you who are attending today's webinar, and we hope that you find the information that will be presented both helpful and instructive as you make use of zirconia in your daily practice. It's my pleasure to turn the time over to Dr. Hill. Dr. Hill, the time is yours.
All right, thank you. And thank everybody for attending. I've done a number of these at Ivoclar. I'm an employee of Ivoclar Vivadent, and this for quite a long while. I'm a materials engineer and have done a lot of materials with zirconia and all the other materials that are used in dentistry here in Amherst, New York. And I always find it funny because I learn what a materials engineer feels like when you get in this industry and when you're hired by a company at Ivoclar. I always joke about it that when I was first hired, the company gave us a login name, and the first two letters were the country you're in, which we are in the US. The third and fourth letter were the first two letters, your name, which my last name's Hill, and then the final letter was the first letter of your first name, which is Thomas, or T in this case. So I like to say I've been up at Ivoclar for over 23 years now, and I'm still affectionately known as you shit, which I shouldn't take any offense to, but we've even changed the name of the company from Ivoclar Vivadent to Ivoclar, yet I still have to keep you shit as a login. So kind of just live with it and try to share information. I try to give what facts, and if you guys have any questions at all anytime or need to contact me, you're more than welcome to. Kind of getting into this, zirconia, and I was around before it was ever really even present in this industry. Now, at least lab side, it represents over 75% of all restorations leaving labs today. It is dominant in the market, and we need to understand what it is. We first launched our first zirconia, and then we started making new ones. My very first presentation right after is one called Not All Zirconias Are the Same. And it's interesting to me because even after all this time, I still feel that the industry has a very short understanding of what really zirconia is. And it's a term that's thrown out there, and there is as much difference in mechanical properties, aesthetics, and all else in the type of zirconias that are available than there literally is in all other materials that are available for dentists for restorative purposes. And so you can see that there are quite a number of different zirconias in the industry today. So I'll start off with a thing called differentiating between zirconia materials, and I call it the Y's of zirconia, and the Y's have to do with an element called yttria. And so zirconia is what we call a polycrystalline ceramic, meaning that it has no secondary phase, much like, say, a glass ceramic, which has crystal phase and a glass amorphous phase. So you can't really etch this type of material. It is very opaque because of this in comparison to a lot of the other materials that you work with. So it has only grain boundaries, and these grain boundaries really dictate, as you can see in some of the pictures and things I'll show, the translucency and the mechanical properties of this material. So how you make this material is really, it's called from a thing called zircon sand, and there's a process which highly purifies this into zirconia powder, which is made about 10 microns in diameter in all of these powders. For very long time, there was one company called Toso who uses this powder to a very high efficiency and created a very high purity zirconia that's out on the market and is used for everything. So when we make zirconia, any company, what we do is we take those powders, and there's different chemicals that are added. We press them, and that processing takes a lot into what comes out, and it's either called hipping or sipping, which is cold isostatic pressing or hot isostatic pressing. And then what happens is a lab will get it, and it will be about 50% density, and that's when this is milled, which is good and bad. It's good because any that's in the type of restoration that's done. Any mishap in there is, and then finally you have to mill these materials down and become very high precision. Zirconia not is an oxide material. There's no such thing as zirconia oxide. Ceramic engineers, we ran into the idea that we got tired of saying oxide. So instead of saying like silicon oxide, aluminum oxide, titanium oxide, we said titania, alumina, and silica. In this case, it's zirconia. It's 2 oxygen atoms to 1 zirconium atom. And what makes this material unique is it's what we call a polymorphic ceramic, meaning that you can take these different elements or these different atoms and you can put them together in different ways. Monoclinic, tetragonal, and cubic. And it's important to understand because these are very important to the outcome of what this type of material is as far as mechanical properties and also aesthetic properties. And so when you take zirconia and you have it at room temperature, it would standard be in a monolithic state, meaning if we added no secondary elements and we have pure zirconia, as you heat it up to around 1200 degrees Celsius, it gets up into a tetragonal phase. And if you keep heating it up to around 2400 degrees Celsius, it turns into cubic. As you would cool these back down, what will happen is they will spontaneously transform into the lower temperature stable phases. Now, what we do is we go ahead and we add different elements, most notably yttria. And if you put the exact right amount in, you can do what is called stabilize or partially stabilize, meaning that when you lower the temperature, it stays in the higher temperature state. And so what's interesting about this is if you add just the right amount of yttria in there, it partially stabilizes the tetragonal phase, and then it can't convert into the monoclinic phase unless something else occurs. And that something else is if you introduce a crack into the material. And what that does is it opens up enough space in there that the surrounding atoms hold it in place. But once there's a crack in there, it spontaneously transforms into the monoclinic state. And that monoclinic state has a much higher density, and it will go ahead and, I'm sorry, the tetragonal phase has a much higher density. In the monoclinic state is lower, but has a much higher volume, and it pinches the crack shut. So what this is it's like a self-healing mechanism, and it's what gives zirconia its unique, really high mechanical properties, and this process is called phase transformation toughening. But as I said, that was nice ones were tetragonal zirconias, but not all zirconias are the same today. And so probably a company in dentistry that no one's ever heard of. They were a Japanese company that provides the majority of dental manufacturer companies in the world zirconia powders. And so they started out, and originally they produced what's called substructure zirconias. If you've been in the industry long enough, you know these were the zirconias that you had to go ahead and put some sort of porcelain on to be able to get some sort of aesthetic outcome. And these had about 5.2 weight percent. Now that is in the range of about 3 molar percent of yttria in these, but they also had alumina, and that alumina was at the grain boundaries and caused a lot of scattering. When they reduced the alumina, this became what is in today and what is most notably recognized in the industry as a full contour zirconia. This is Bruxier, any LT types of zirconias in there. The problem was that these materials, though they could start being used in full contour restorations, they still were too opacious for the average dentist and patient. And so what happens was the materials kept evolving. And what they did was they actually went and created what's called cubic zirconia. Now this has much more yttria, about 9.3 weight percent, which is about 5 mole percent. And so this 5 mole percent allowed for about a microstructure that had about 50% cubic phase and 50% tetragonal phase. And you can see in there in the green area, what that did was that allowed the light transmission to basically increase by about 15%. But the problem was these materials that in strength and fracture toughness, which are the mechanical properties that we examine when we talk about the uses of these materials, decreased greatly, basically in half. And then what came along later on was what's called an MT zirconia, and it's really just these two powders. It's a 3Y and a 5Y, which are mixed together in proper ratios. And what's strange in material science is that these materials, when mixed at this ratio, actually produced properties, meaning physical properties and optical properties, which were right in the middle of these two. And so we have a nice continuum of different types of materials. So what you end up with is in a 3Y, a very opacious material that has extremely high strength and toughness. This is the material that everybody thinks of when they think of zirconia. But then you have this HT zirconia, which is working its way back aesthetically in a lot of ways to say a glass ceramic such as a lithium disilicate, but the properties actually fall in the same range as a lithium disilicate also, as we will see later on. And so looking at the microstructure, this is an overview of these three types of materials. You got the 3Y molar percent, which is about 5% weight percent, but it's 100% tetragonal, very small microstructure, a lot of scattering when light tries to travel through it. And then you have the 4Y, which is in between the 5 and the 3 there. And it's got about 25% cubic phase and about 75% tetragonal phase. And it has properties in the middle. So it's got more aesthetics than a 3Y, but not quite the strength, but more strength than a 5Y, but not quite the translucency and the aesthetics. And then finally the 5Y, which is the weakest of it, but then also the most aesthetic of the zirconias and the most translucent. And as said, the tetragonal phase controls these mechanical properties, fracture toughness and strength. So when we looked at it, and we've done a lot of testing internally and do a lot of different types of testing, what we found was, but you basically doubled the toughness of the material when you go from, say, a 5Y material, which is what that katana material is, up to about over 5 and fracture toughness when you have an LT, which is the 3Y. And when you get that 5Y, really end up with mechanical properties that are very to a lithium silicate type of material. And so what is interesting to me is that we call all of these zirconias, but a 5Y zirconia is probably more similar to a glass ceramic than it is what to the average person thinks a zirconia material is, as far as strength, the thickness of their restorations and things like that. So this is just a chart that has all the properties of these in comparison to, say, a lithium disilicate, and you can see that in there as far as the numbers for that. The challenge with zirconia, though, is that it has what is called a high index of refraction, meaning that light scatters off that surface. And so it's got a very glossy surface that reflects light. And so there's a limit to the aesthetics that you can get with the zirconia when it is not glazed or something like that. And it is because of this, the high index refraction and the tetragonal and the cubic phase, where the tetragonal phase is dependent on the crystal orientation and gives a phenomenon called birefringence, which scatters the light, where the cubic does not scatter the light and bend it the same way. And so one of the interesting things, and sure maybe you've seen, late at night on a shopping or something where you see cubic zirconia diamond rings, and these are actually the same cubic. But what's happened with these types is you've gone ahead and you've put it under high temperature and high pressure for such a long period of time that those diamond rings are actually just one grain. It's a single crystal of material. So when we go ahead and look at this material, one of the things that we did for the optical challenge to show it was we put a liquid drop of material that has the index of refraction on enamel on it, and then also on a glass ceramic so you can see. And what happens is that when you see that little bend of white light there where the blue arrows are pointing at, that shows the reflectance off the surface. Through all this time that I've been working with this type of material, what I've done is I've kind of coined a term. I call it depth of translucency. And it's because zirconia light moves through this in that when we change from a 3Y to 5Y, we are actually only changing the translucency of the material internally. And that can be a challenge because what happens is that surface reflectance controls what you see. And so when we look at it, as we go from a 3Y to 5Y, the internal reflectance gets lower, which means it becomes more translucent, but the surface reflectance becomes is the same. It becomes higher in percentage of what you see, and that can be good and bad. The reason why it can be good and bad, well, when we look at the surface reflectance, now what comes to surface roughness affects what we see greater than what you would see ceramic. And interest I've worked with these types of materials is that when you polish these materials, what a lot of people see is pre-polished. And this also occurs, and you'll see images of this later on, of cracks with light um, when it is glazed, and also where your light source is coming from. When we look at how a dentist looks at a zirconia, you take a restoration, you put it in a patient's mouth, and typically your light source will be a very bright light that is either on your forehead or over your shoulder looking into the patient's mouth, and you're looking at the restoration. And so you're getting a very high reflectance off that surface. And what seems to occur with these, and it's more noted, especially in materials and in shades that are more chromatic. And so what happens is when you polish it, you'll get more reflectance off that. It will lighten out and you will not get the chroma that you expect or hope to see. And then your patient goes home and they are looking at themselves in the mirror and they've got a lights above the mirror and they've got some shadowing there and the light is not directly reflecting off of that surface. And so now the chroma jumps out more, but with the higher translucent zirconias, what you can see is a material that has a little bit of grayness in there. And so it can be very more tricky. What I like to say about zirconia with respect to, say, glass ceramics is that when you're dealing with zirconia, you typically don't worry about the mechanical properties of the restoration that these are in, but the optical properties are much more challenging to achieve because there are so many variables that can go into play. And so it is more of a challenge, I would say, for labs and for dentists to understand what kind of aesthetics you're getting out of these. There's so much that goes into the play of what or how these materials are centered, and what kind of polishing you did. Either you glazed it or you didn't. Those sorts of things come into play in here. And definitely, if you are not glazing, surface roughness comes into effect because there are certain areas that a lot of people will tell you, and myself included, that you do not want to go ahead and put any sort of glaze on because especially where there's contact between your zirconia restoration and opposing dentition, which wear it greatly in there because the glaze wears off and becomes like an abrasive sandpaper. So for me, when I was talking about centering these materials, zirconia is a challenge in that there are different ways to center it. And so one of these things that's been introduced recently a lot is trying to do these materials in a vacuum, because what that does is it takes out and Sintering is a process by which zirconia, when it's milled, it's it's kind of a very microstructure Swiss cheese in there. If you try to mill it in its final state, it would be too strong to mill. It would cause issues with burrs, wearing out, and other problems and challenges. So we mill it in this intermediate state, and then when you fire it, it's got these little pores that are between all the particles, and when you mill it, then you're sintering it. And the sintering is a reduction of that surface area of the grain boundaries, but you have to get it down to the grain boundaries. And if you get any pores stuck in there, now we're truly affecting the aesthetic outcome of this type of material and what you can get out of it. So introducing a vacuum can greatly affect the sintering process. It removes the air and counter pressure and allows labs and people to go ahead and sinter faster, and that means that we have less defects, and less defects give better aesthetics in a faster time. The other aspect of this, though, is it's a very challenging thing to do as a material producer, because the mechanical properties of are developed in the early portion of the firing process. And so you can put on the vacuum there, but at the end of it, the color and translucency are developed later on in the process at higher temperatures. But to run those properly, what you do is you have to introduce air. So when we look at it for the mechanical properties, you want to remove the vacuum and any air that's in there, so you don't have any scattering of this. And you can see this in the picture here, where one of them was done in vacuum and one of them was done without vacuum. And the one with vacuum, there are no pores in between any of the grains. This is an SEM done at about 5000x. And then we did with the ones without a vacuum, and what you see is that there are pores. And if we look through this entire structure, you would see these. Those are scattering centers for light when they travel through the material. When we looked at this internally with different types of materials, when we did it in vacuum, what helped was that it took the aesthetics of a material that was more opacious and made it look like, so a 3Y zirconia, and it made it look more like a 4Y zirconia. So what you're doing is you're not losing the mechanical properties, but you're starting to gain the aesthetics even more so when you go ahead and fire this up there. And then looking at this another way, we saw the same thing. So what you can do is, through processing, we are starting to be able to go ahead and optimize the aesthetics and not reduce the mechanical properties. The other aspect of it, as I kind of mentioned a little bit earlier, is that we have an exchange temperature, which means that we have to introduce air. And because we develop the final color and chroma, we have to have oxygen there so that the elements change their electronic state, and that allows them to produce the proper amount of color and chroma in the restoration when we go ahead and fire it. And so it's a very tricky type of thing. So there's a lot that goes into this. Lastly, there's a big challenge when it comes to small volumes versus large volumes, because they sinter and densify at two different rates. And so when you have say we have a single unit, or we have a large bridge with large ponic in there, we have to be careful in how these are fired, and they really should have two different firing and sintering cycles. And so when we have small restorations, they will start to sinter faster because they have less mass, but they also have temperature that's traveling through the restoration, which is a insulator, and it takes a little while longer to go ahead and get down through it. So we have to be very careful when we do all of that. So that's kind of the basics of zirconia, firing it and getting into. And what we've done with our materials internally is a concept called GT technology. And it's probably made my life more challenging than anything else. We talked about the 3Y, the 4Y, the 5Y zirconias, and so things. But when you complicate things, you get better things out of it. To complicate things, what we did was we started mixing these types of zirconias with an intelligent concept to be able to marry these materials. So what we could do is we can put the high aesthetics, the 5Y zirconia, in an area and in a way that where you need the aesthetics. So on the incisal edge of restorations and things like that. And yet we could continue within the restoration and within the puck, we would blend it into a 3Y material, which would give you the high strength and toughness. And so what we were trying to do is maximize the world of the beauty and the beast in this case. And so we call this GT technology. And so it combines a special material and technology. We have the 5Y in there for high translucency, and the 3Y, which gives you the really high strength and toughness. And so it's a lot more challenging than it would seem like, because you have to go ahead and condition these powders. You have to have a very unique way of bringing these powders together. We started by trying one on each other, and it looked like a Neapolitan ice cream. Does not work so well. You get very hard lines in here, and you'll see some later on. And then we have a very high quality, high production process, which allows for a very nice uniform restoration and uniform centering and very high accuracy of fit of these types of restorations. So going through that. So when we're dealing with the gradient technology, which is in two types of materials that we make, one of them is called Zircad Prime Aesthetic, and the other one's called Zircad Prime. Even internally, we don't use the IPS, EMAX, Zircad Prime Aesthetic. At Ivoclar, I will say that I believe even personally that our names are too long. So if you ever want to talk about it, it's Prime, and Prime Aesthetic is what we call it. And we have these three things that come into both play. So what are they? Well, first is the special powder conditioning. Why? Because we want to marry this 3Y and 5Y in the prime material. Well, the problem is that when you fire them, they shrink. And yes, they will shrink the same amount, but they shrink at different rates. And if you don't do any conditioning to them, you will go ahead and have the material and the restoration bend and move on you, and you will get distortion. And so you won't have uniform shrinkage on there. And because my company is always so kind to me, when I first asked them how we were doing this, they wouldn't tell me. So I just went to the patent literature in the US, like anybody can do, and I looked it up. And what it showed was we had a patent on adjusting 3Y and 5Y centering curves, and you wanted to increase the centering curve of 3Y, in other words, make it center faster. And then with the 5Y, you wanted to slow it down. And so we added these small amounts in here, and what we did was put them in there homogeneously, and that way this leads to a very high accuracy of fit. The two elements are already been named in there at one time, are special salts of yttria and of alumina, which heat up and speed up these two powders. And what it does is it brings those centering curves together. And so what happens is when you have, before you put them in, they would be each one of those lines. So the 3Y would center in that first line, the 5Y would center in that second line. But after you condition the powders, they merge together, and they go ahead. Second is a unique filling technology. You can't just lay these materials down. So the way I've always described this is it's like going ahead and taking two pitchers of the material and pouring the one to start with. And then at some point in there, you go ahead and you pour in the second one, and you start to reduce back on the first one until it finally stops and you're only pouring the second one. So it's a complete gradient. There is no steps. There's no steps. There's no layers in this material. It looks very, very natural and very organic in the material. And so you have that. And then you have an increase in translucency as you get up there also. And you can see how this looks in a restoration. There's a seamless shade and translucent gradation that occurs and no layers in the material. Then another aspect of this was what we call the intelligent disc concept. And that was that when we went ahead and made the disc, a lot of other companies will go ahead and they put in these different shaded or different chromatic layers, and they make them as a function of percentage. We went ahead and said, no, really, you only need the top 3 millimeters before shrinkage to be in that very high, low chromatic, or I'm sorry, low strength area. And then we have the gradiated area. And we found that after examining natural dentition, this is the way that the materials worked and did in there. So you can position them exactly the same. And then finally, as I said, we have multiple processes and steps that we go ahead and run, which allow us to get better homogeneity, meaning it's all even. So when the shrinkage comes down, and we get better translucency because of that and faster centering cycles. Beyond that, when we started with the concept of a 3-5Y, which had the extreme high strength and toughness. But what we found was we wanted to go to the next level. So generation 2.0, if you want, is what we call Zircad Prime Aesthetic. And we're actually only using 4-5 in here. And we're using that gradient technology. And what it does is we're decreasing the number of uses. You can see up here, it says covers approximately 70% of dental restorations, meaning most single crowns and 3-unit bridges, but it offers, and we went ahead and went to the next level aesthetics with this material. And I would argue that this is the most aesthetic zirconia that is on the market today, still going. And so if you're putting this anywhere in an aesthetic region, you want to use zirconia, you can start to reach the aesthetics that are, I guess, getting into the range of a glass ceramic. I personally will never say that glass ceramics, because of that surface reflectance that comes off there, will be a challenge for that. And we have the same intelligent disc concept where you have 3 and 4 millimeters in there and the way that it gradiates. But what we did was we went ahead and reviewed what we saw when we did the original, and we said we need to have a higher incisor value. We need to have more chroma. We talked about that coming out there. Our incisal gray, we needed to create the illusion more transparency using some gray in there so it looks more natural in there. And then we have a more chromatic incisal area in the smooth transition. So basically, learn from our mistakes in the original, not mistakes, but shortcomings in the original material, and we aesthetically, and we went ahead and went and created that. So the whole concept was matte or chroma match or slightly higher, and then in the incisal, lighter colors, mid-range, more chroma, lower value, and the gray, as we talked about there earlier. And so what we did was we took basically 2 powders. These are the HT and LT for us. And then we started changing the coloring irons and putting in this. There was a lot of work that was put into here to get the proper mix of that. And so if you kind of think about it, what we're doing is you can't put the same amount of chroma in a 3Y or a 5Y material. We had to go ahead and better understand and get that to maximize the aesthetics in there. And then we made sure that these elements in here, so you can see you got zirconia, iridium, iron. Those are different coloring irons that are in there that are now more homogeneously distributed within the material and the powder and the puck, that now gave you a proper look that looks more natural in there. And then finally, the approach of this material, where with the prime, it is designed to be a much stronger material that can be used for roundhouse bridges, implant cases, and things like that. This one was, can we make it faster? And so, because of the high amount of aesthetics that we put in this type of material, we went ahead and said, okay, the concept was we're going to focus with the process of mill, center, glaze, slash, polish, and you're done. Meaning, for a technician or for a dentist, you don't need to come back and add any other characterization or chroma or staining and glazing that's in there. You can glaze it to get the high, or you can just polish and move forward if you want to. So for us, when we got it, we looked at it internally and kind of went through all the unique properties of these materials and wanted to make sure what we were saying was proper. And we looked at a lot of different types of outcomes and things of why a dentist and a technician think that this material is more beneficial than other zirconias that are on the market. So in our lab in Amherst here in near Buffalo, we were analyzing the homogeneity, and what we did was we used a material or a process called Control X. And what you do is you scan in the STL file that you would have there, and then we went ahead and went through the process and used the exact same mill STL file and firing temperatures that are defined by the company themselves in there. And actually, these were made outside of our lab at an independent lab that is well known, and went ahead and ran. And then we went ahead and scanned these and looked at it. And what we wanted to do was we wanted to look at the worst case scenario, looking at the homogeneity of these. And so what this is a picture, and where the green is, we could look implant case, so an all on four. And so the other aspect of it was we wanted to look at different thickness pucks because they come into play of how they were doing and working with this. So we have a 16 as our smallest puck thickness wise, and a 25 is our most thick. And then what we did was we ran it against another competitor, which is a true multi, much like ours. And we looked at 50 microns first to see what their smallest puck was, an 18. So they're even thicker than ours when they first milled it. And then they had a 25. And you can see where that red area is. You're getting in the range of somewhere over 200 microns of a deviation of what you should be getting. Now, down, you may be able to get it to fit on the patients on an implant, but this could also cause complications later on when you're dealing with the material against another competitor. Same thing. The red is a micron gap difference that's there. And what you see is that there are certain areas, especially with the way that the arch would shrink, that pulls that, give the patient and also the implant issues later on when it was being in the patient's mouth. Maybe not in the beginning, but it may be a tight fit or something that would cause issues coming down the road. And then we went back, and what we did was we said, okay, not 50 microns, that may be too much. Let's look at 100, and you still see the same outcome with the first one and the same outcome with the second one when we ran it. And then we had a monolithic one that was in there. So basically, this was a competitor that did not have the same aesthetic or chromatic differences that you would want with a type of restoration that you would get out of these other materials, but a monolithic one. And because it was made all out of one type of material, it also did fairly well at this level. Then we look at the continuous gradient, which we've discussed here. This was Zircad Prime, and with one of the multi-competitors, you can see these bands of lines in here about a fourth of the way down and about middle there, where you start to see straight lines across that, where with the gradient, it transitions in there. Another one just changes, tries to use chroma as a change, and you do not see a difference in the translucency, and there's the monolithic coming in there. So this gives you the advantage, and you'll see that when we get to the shade accuracy. So coming back to these competitors, these are the three competitors or the three materials. We have the prime on the right there, and what you can see is just coming out of the mill, looking at the chroma of where this is sitting on a natural dye 2 natural dye, and you can see that the other two are not coming out here, but these are their A2 materials. And so what you do see, and what we stated, is that there's a lot of difference when you go ahead and you start to glaze them. So when we take competitor one, when it's out of the mill, but now when we glaze it, and we had to add stain to get it to that point where it actually looked like an A2 from the A2 Vita Shade Guide. So what it means is that these materials are coming out, they're marked as an A2, but they're not reaching what would be acceptable as an A2 type of restoration. And looking at this in much larger, yeah, you do want to go, if you are going to get with these other competitors are in there, you must stain and glaze these materials to reach the aesthetic acceptability. And the same thing with the second one. We saw the again this type, and if you want to get, and you can see the left to the right getting the chroma out of there also. And then finally with the prime, we only glazed it. So this is what it looks like when you go ahead and just glaze the material. And you don't see as much of a difference between this. Why? Because of the way that the material is made. So looking at selection, as I said, I'm a materials engineer, and why and when would you use these types of materials? These are the basic mechanical properties that we have of the different types of zirconias that are on the market today. And I can tell you from doing a lot of testing, most everything that's coming out is actually in that 4Y zirconia that's being introduced by different manufacturers. What I was saying here was that as a materials engineer, we actually have a standard for how to use different types of zirconias and in what indications. So when we look at Emax Prime, we know that where the lower portion is, that's in 3Y, and that these values follow. And in this classification, they use strength and toughness of these types of materials in what indications you can use. So that is what's called a category 5 type of material. It goes ahead and allows you to use full, basically anywhere within the mouth involving 4 or more units. When we look at the prime aesthetic, now that we're using the 4 and 5Y material, it's got a fracture toughness around 375. It's got a strength that's in the range of 750 to 800. And those numbers as for strength can definitely be massively manipulated. So I lean towards fracture toughness. But these are the indications where you can use it for 3-unit processes and all, and for that. So when we look at the two types of materials I described, in comparison to all zirconias, the 3, 4, 5s basically fall in here where it's kind of backwards in the nomenclature for what's on this standard here, where a 3 Y material would be a class 5, meaning anything. You can use zirconia for any type of restoration that is out there with the 3. It may not be the best aesthetic one, and when you get to the 4, it would be in class 4, which is monolithic for 3-unit prostheses involving molars, and you can have full coverage, 3 units. So basically, any 3, some 4-unit restorations that are in there. And then your 5Ys actually follow into this class 3, which is really single unit types of restorations. You really don't want to go into a longer span type of bridge. When we look at our monochromatic versus our polychromatic, meaning in our world we have an MT, which is a 4Y, and an LT, which is in 3Y. Basically, our preparation guidelines are almost exactly the same. The only real difference in there is you see that with the prime, it's not the same as the LT. And part of that is because of this gradient technology, we have to protect ourselves in labs against some people will try to take those and push restorations to vertically up to the top because they want to have more translucency in aesthetics. And so what they don't do is they don't put the restoration where 3Y is in there, and they're putting part of the restoration where high stresses are into other areas. One of the things I did want to talk about on this is the preparation guidelines. And it is really important that we follow these because I think when the 3Ys first came out, it was a big, you could use it anyway. You could do feather edge. The pure 3Ys are so strong that they could pretty much handle everything. And that's what everybody seemed to like about this. You still didn't want to do it if you could help it, but that's what people did anyways, and were in there. And you could use any type of cementation. One of the issues I found with this as I've moved along with zirconia is that one of the things that dentists seem to like is, well, I don't have to do adhesive cementation. And it's much easier not to do that. I don't have to control the environment as much in there. I can use things like glass ionomer. I can use things like self-adhesive cements, and it all works. Well, the problem with that was when you go to that, you have to go back to more conventional prep designs in here, which means that in here that the prep angles for the conventional and semi-adhesive need to be between that 4 and 8, where when you get to adhesive cementation, you have a more laxed thing in there, and you have to control how you serve the material by preparing it for adhesive cementation in there. So with the cementation, there are a lot of different types of things that are out there. We basically at Ivoclar and other people, we fall into three of them. Adhesive, that's your highest strength, your best bond that's in there, but there are more steps for it. And your conventional is less, it's very simple in there, but you have to have a more retentive prep for the conventional, where with the adhesive you can have less retention. And sometimes I think that this is where some of these issues and challenges work with this type of material in there. The bond strengths need to be high for the adhesive type of cementation and low for the bond strengths on this, and the mechanical properties of those cements that are in there. So in reality, what I'm in my discussions with people, I find that they use all sorts of these types of cements, and push one in here. They like to have full in there, but it really depends on three factors when you're considering what type of cement to use in there. Well, one of them is the restorative type, and this is zirconia, which is an oxide ceramic. It comes into play. But what type of restoration will you be in place? And then what is the condition of the preparation? And part of that, I think, comes into, because I've had a lot of discussions with different people out here about a second molar zirconia restoration. And it's always zirconia being so tough, being put in that situation. And then you have to come back and you go, but you still have to bond it, because your vertical dimension is probably not going to be great enough that you got to have a retentive prep in there. And so I've had a lot of discussions with people in the industry, and me personally, I have a way that I run it and things like in there. One of the things I did want to really highlight was that preparation guidelines and stuff. As you go to a material that is stronger and you're going to go conventional cementation, you're putting the restoration strength in there. But if you want it to be retained, you need to go ahead and have proper preparation angles, or it won't stay in there. And then another thing that comes into play with these is the translucency of the material, because the lithium disilicate is very translucent. You can get light through it. Metals, obviously, you can't. Zirconia is kind of in the middle there. And if you are trying to use an adhesive and it needs to be light cured, it really has to get in there to fully cure. So you need to be careful about something like that. And then finally in here, you can see this was just released this month in here, and I've been part of this for many years now. And what they had stated in here is resin modified glass ionomer the best material? And they have a whole bunch of difference, and I would definitely check this out. They've been dealing with it for 25 years, and I understand this. And they're saying the first debonds before things happen. Well, with the resins, when they're debonds, what they found was after about 2 years, you see some of these debonds. Where with the RMGI, you don't see as many, and it takes longer to occur. I personally do like resin modified glass ionomer a lot more, actually, for the bio aspect of this. But that's where I kind of get back to. I think the people who are dealing with the RMGI probably are giving better preparations than the people with the resin, because a lot of time the people with the resin will leave all that bonding to stick with the chemical adhesive nature of the material itself. And so finally, my personal way in dealing with all these is that when you're going to handle this material in zirconia, no matter what it is, you need to sandblast it. And that's kind of one of the ironies of zirconia is if you have a 3Y and you sandblast it, it gets stronger. If you have a 5Y, it gets weaker. And if you have a 4Y, it stays about the same. But you want to sandblast it with aluminum oxide, 50 micron, 1 to 1.5 bar. And then you're going to want to go ahead and put a primer on there. You only need to actually put that primer on there if you're doing adhesive cementation. And do not use any phosphoric acid to clean these restorations if you're going to bond it. Now, if you're going to use a glass ionomer or something else in there, then you can go ahead and do that. And then if you want to clean it, there are a few cleaning agents out there. From Ivoclar, we have IvoClean. Other companies have started to produce them that clean the surface without interrupting that bond surface in there. And then obviously you can use any type of cementation that you want after with this type of material. So in summary, with the Prime, it's high end. It's really designed to be, and all indications can work for everything across the board. Highest aesthetics you can get with the 3Y type of material, and using this gradient technology to produce more aesthetics in there. Where when you get to the Prime aesthetic, it's using the 4-5. Now we're getting in translucencies compared to say lithium disilicate. It gives you the option of doing a polishing or a glazing in there. And it gives you a very reproducible process that produces the aesthetics that you come to depend upon that's in there. So thank you for putting up. Sorry with the little. I always like to throw this in at the end of mine because I like to say that in dentistry we do some pretty amazing and incredible things, and when we put a lot of time and effort into it, we can do some really amazing outcomes in here. I've watched that video probably 1,000 times, and I do point out one thing in there. I do not know if it's real. I would kind of like to go over to Liechtenstein, which is where the parent company is, and maybe have a couple beverages and try it out if we are. But I do know that if it were me or any male that would want to have children later on in life, that front board, I would have put some sort of cushion there just in case I came up a little bit short, especially with all of the planning and timing that they put into the rest of it. So I want to thank you for your time and attention. Um, and sticking with me through that little challenge in there. If you have any questions, I'm more than happy to answer it. And I hope that you were able to take away some things that help you in using zirconia. It's a great material. It works very well, and obviously it has grown in this industry enormously in the last decade or so, and can be used without any challenges in here. The biggest challenge with it is finding the proper lab, and making sure that they know how to use their zirconia to maximize the aesthetics from these types of restorations in here. So thank you again, and I will take any questions that you have.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hill, for sharing your expertise on this topic. We do have a number of questions. One of the first questions is related to this gradient technology. Is that
Yeah.
available in all of your zirconia products, or is it only in the Prime CAD family?
No, really, gradient technology. I only know of a couple companies besides us that actually use the multiple powders. And I showed a couple of them there when I had the images. No, the gradient technology is pretty much exclusive to Ivoclar and to Prime and Prime Aesthetic. Even in our other materials like LT or MT, those are not in there. And it's not really even in our MT multi. That's an old version of those materials. So no, that's really in the Prime series.
Great, thank you for that answer. Kind of along those lines, I have a question from a clinician asking, how do I know, what zirconia I'm getting from my dental lab?
Um, you have to ask them. I would love to say that there's ways of looking at it. First of all, you're gonna have to trust them and say you tell them. And I can tell you one thing that all companies do when they send out, they actually have to send out stickers with it that show what the zirconia is that they can give out if they want to. But if they're not meeting your demands as far as aesthetics and as far as what they state they're doing, you might want to go with a better lab. I know Arrowhead, I've worked with these guys for 20 years and I know their quality, so I'm not even doubting that. But really, you have to ask, yeah, can we look at, we've looked at certain cases in here, but we can't look at all of them in there. But in reality, if they're not using proper, you will have issues either mechanically or aesthetically.
Great, thank you for that. And now, kind of going to a question back on the gradient technology. It says that you mentioned the gradient technology has a weaker strength at the incisal edge. So, what
Correct.
would you recommend for bruxers and for restorations in the molar area?
Um, I play with the concept of something I actually got from Rella Christensen. She and I've had many conversations in there. And it really comes down to what we call the beauty and the beast. I would actually, because in general, most patients aren't in a second molar or so that that concerned about aesthetics back there. And I probably would go with a just a pure 3Y, which would be in our case an LT. You have a good lab who can add some characterization, buccally and lingually and things like that, which would do it. But what you don't want to do with the Bruxer is you definitely don't want to fully glaze it. You want to have contact with an LT material, meaning a 3Y, because zirconia has a very low mu of friction and will minimize any wear to the posing dentition. So that's where I would go. I probably wouldn't go with a prime or a prime aesthetic for a Bruxer because of what you stated there, where you have the weaker material in the incisal edge. Though it still should be more than strong enough, but with respect to a Bruxer themselves, I probably would go with an LT material.
Great, thank you for that. And then
Yep.
you mentioned during your presentation that polishing a zirconia restoration causes it to lighten. When you have a crown that you have to adjust that's zirconia, is there some things you can do to mitigate compromising the aesthetics too much?
I mean, first of all, I assume you're talking about one that has already been placed within the patient's mouth that you can't take out. The best way to mitigate it, obviously, is through glazing. And that really does help it, because what it does is as light's coming in the glazed layer, it gets scattered and it makes it look much, much more naturally. You could see it hopefully in those pictures that I showed. As respect without that, it would be very challenging in there. Once you polished it, you could come back a little bit on the polishing. I don't want to use the word roughen it up, maybe not polish it as much. A lot of people I know like to use intraoral pastes, and when you get to those pastes, that's when you can get a um, real reflectance, some iridescence even there, grazed out. It just does not look naturally. You may want to go back uh, to that and try to get what we call an orange peel effect, where it's not as smooth and reflectance on that surface.
Great, thank you. And we have another question about the zirconia prime aesthetic, and the question is, can it be bonded well enough to use with minimal prep veneers?
Yeah, it definitely can. You're going to want to use some sort of phosphoric agent in there, meaning that most of the primers that are out there, use some sort of phosphifying agent. I know we have one, which is our I don't know why I'm losing the name, but it's our multi-link or the primer, and it has a phosphate grouping in there. We find that those phosphate primers, usually in the bonding region, give you somewhere in this little layer. It won't be quite silane bonding, but you're into 80-90% of that, which is more than good enough for a veneer.
Great. And we have one last question, and it has to do with like full arch reconstructions and full mouth cases.
Yep.
This clinician is asking, if they were to ask their lab for specific zirconias, is there, should they be prescribing a certain zirconia like prime cat in the posterior and prime aesthetic in the anterior? Where does that kind of break?
Well, I mean, it first of all, the prime aesthetic has a limitation in the size of it because it is a 4Y. One of the things when we first launched Prime, I've always said that it is the roundhouse bridge type of material. That's where I see it excel. I think you can do a lot of amazing things with it, and you have the high strength and toughness. And the other aspect of it is you've got a monolithic type of restoration when we get into the roundhouse. Um, yeah, I always we have a lot of internal conversations about how heavy that must feel in the patient's mouth, but I've seen it way too often, that I know it works out there, and I know from with respect to this that really, because of the precision of its fit, the aesthetics, the change that you can do in there. and then you really have a very high strength, high aesthetic restoration. So with a roundhouse, I would say that prime is probably the optimum material. That's where I really like it. Where I'm getting to shorter restorations, that's where you would go to things like prime aesthetic. Any other type of material that they would try to do a roundhouse bridge on and an implant bridge, you would run into challenges that either the material is not going to reach the same aesthetics unless they go ahead and characterize it to a great deal, and you're going to characterize it using a porcelain, and that's going to be a challenge later on. Or you're going to go ahead and have not the same aesthetics and have a very monolithic restoration, which is made out of either, which is gonna has to be made out of a 3Y zirconia. So I would say that the prime is the best material available on the market for a roundhouse bridge because you get this monolithic nature with highest aesthetics.
Great. Well, thank you, Dr. Hill, for spending some time with us today. We really appreciate the time and effort you put into this presentation. And to close, just thank you again for your time and attention, and we look forward to having you at future Arrowhead webinars. Until next time.